They found the first body 8 feet down, then another, then more. The graves had been dug deep. The people who had made them had intended them to stay hidden. But 3 years in the cold Russian soil had done something that the killers had not accounted for. It had preserved the bodies in a state that made identification possible. The uniforms were recognizable. The documents in the pockets were legible. The bullets in the skulls all fired from behind. At close range, into the base of the cranium were identifiable by caliber and type. The German soldiers who found the graves in April 1943 called their headquarters called Berlin, and Berlin, which had spent the previous year losing territory to the Soviet army and losing credibility with its own population, suddenly had something it had not expected to find in a Russian forest. A gift. On April 13. Radio Berlin announced that German forces had discovered mass graves containing the bodies of Polish military officers near Katyn, in territory recently recaptured from the Soviet Union. The Germans invited international observers. They invited the International Red Cross. They brought in an international commission of forensic experts from 12 countries. They brought in American prisoners of war. They published photographs. They released documents. Every single piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The Polish officers had been killed in the spring of 1940, more than a year before Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, which meant that when they were killed, the Katyn forest was under Soviet control, which meant the Soviet Union had done it. 2 days after the German announcement, Moscow responded. The Soviet Information Bureau issued a communiqué. It described the German claim as monstrous invention. It called the German announcement a base lie. It stated that the Polish officers had been engaged in construction work west of Smolensk in 1941 and had been murdered by the invading German army after overrunning the area in August of that year. The Soviet Union blamed Germany for the massacre that the Soviet Union had committed. This is not an allegation. This is not a historical interpretation that reasonable people dispute. The Soviet Union killed 22,000 Polish officers, policemen, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and intellectuals in the spring of 1940. Then, when the bodies were discovered, it blamed Germany. It maintained this lie through international tribunals, through Cold War diplomacy, through the forced compliance of Poland's communist government for 50 years. 50 years of manufactured perpetrator, the most sustained, most institutionally comprehensive example of false attribution in modern history. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes Katyn one of the defining case studies in this season, is not just that the lie was told. It is that it was believed, or at least accepted, by people who had reasons to know better, in countries that had the information to see through it, for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with geopolitical convenience. The Katyn lie survived not because it was convincing. It survived because it was useful. On September 17, the Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border. This was not, from the Soviet perspective, a hostile act. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had assigned eastern Poland to the Soviet sphere. The Red Army was, in the official framing, not invading, but liberating the Belarusian and Ukrainian populations of eastern Poland from Polish rule. The reality was straightforward occupation. And the occupation immediately produced a problem that the Soviet state approached with the ruthless efficiency it had developed during 2 decades of Stalinist terror. The problem, approximately 250,000 Polish soldiers and officers had surrendered to or been captured by Soviet forces. Among them, approximately 22,000 military officers, reserve officers, from civilian life doctors, lawyers, engineers, university professors, judges, policemen who represented, in aggregate, a significant portion of Poland's educated professional class, its officer corps, its institutional leadership. The officers were separated from the enlisted men. They were transported to 3 prisoner of war camps in western Russia. Kozelsk approximately 500 officers, in a former monastery complex near the town of Kozelsk. Starobelsk approximately 900 officers, in a former convent in eastern Ukraine. Ostashkov approximately 6. Tigaratus men, primarily policemen and gendarmerie officers, in a former monastery on an island in a lake near Tver. The conditions at the camps were, by the accounts of the prisoners who kept diaries, and by the testimony of the guards who survived to give evidence later, and harsh but not brutally so. The officers were confined, questioned extensively by NKVD interrogators, and subjected to political re-education lectures they generally found either tedious or contemptible. But they were fed, they were housed, and they were allowed to write letters to their families. Letters that arrived were censored and were kept in NKVD files. This last fact would become important. The diaries the prisoners kept, the letters they wrote, in the specific dates of their last recorded communications, all of it left a documentary record that the subsequent cover-up would have to contend with. Throughout the winter of 1939, the NKVD interrogators were doing something more purposeful than gathering intelligence. They were building files. They were assessing each prisoner, his political views, his family connections, his professional background, his likelihood of becoming a focus of Polish nationalist resistance if he were ever released. The conclusions were not favorable. In February 1940, Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, the man who ran Stalin's secret police apparatus with the efficiency of a bureaucrat and the ethics of something considerably worse, submitted a proposal to Stalin. The Beria Memorandum, dated March 5, described the Polish prisoners as hardened, incorrigible enemies of Soviet authority, and recommended their execution. The document was signed by Stalin, co-signed by Voroshilov, Molotov, and Mikoyan. A note at the bottom recorded the absence of Kalinin and Kaganovich from the signing session, with the implication that their approval would be obtained separately. The Soviet Politburo, the ruling body of the largest country on earth, had just signed the death warrant for 22,000 people. Not because these people had committed crimes, not because there was evidence of specific counter-revolutionary activity, because they were educated, because they were Polish, because they were the kind of people who, if Poland ever regained its independence, would be in positions of leadership. The NKVD's logic was the logic of preemptive elimination. Kill the leadership class of a nation before they can threaten you. It was the same logic that had produced the Great Purge of the 1930s, the mass executions of Soviet citizens that had eliminated entire categories of people deemed potentially dangerous to the Stalinist state. The Polish officers were being processed by the same machine that had already killed millions of Soviet citizens. They had the misfortune of being prisoners of a state that regarded human beings as problems to be managed, and that had developed, through years of practice, a very efficient method of management. In Aprilo 1940, the transports began. From Kozelsk, officers were loaded onto buses and driven to a rail siding, a train, then more buses, then, eventually, the Katyn forest, where NKVD men were waiting, where the graves had been dug. The method was efficient. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back with rope. He was walked into the forest. A single shot to the base of the skull. From a German-made Walther pistol. The body was placed in the grave. The next prisoner brought forward. This process was repeated, roughly daily, through April and May, 1940. By the end of May, approximately 22,000 Polish prisoners had been shot. The last entries in their diaries dated from April 1940. The executioners were efficient. Beria reported to Stalin in August 1940 that the operation had been completed. He recommended monetary awards for the 124 NKVD men who had carried out the killings. Officers received additional monthly wages. Ordinary NKVD men received 800 rubles each. The families did not know. The Polish government in exile in London did not know, or at least could not prove, what it suspected. When the Soviet Union and Poland's government in exile became nominal allies after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Polish general Władysław Anders began organizing a Polish army on Soviet soil. He noticed something. The officers he needed to build this army were missing. He asked Soviet authorities about the 15,000 Polish officers who had been interned in the Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov camps. Soviet authorities told him they had been released. They were somewhere in the Soviet Union, perhaps Manchuria, perhaps somewhere remote. The records had been misplaced. These things happened in wartime. Anders kept asking. Stalin told him, in a personal meeting in December 1941, that all Polish prisoners had been freed, and that if they could not be found, they had perhaps escaped to Manchuria or Iran. 22,000 officers. Missing. Escaped to Manchuria. Stalin said this with a straight face. Anders kept asking. The answers kept not making sense. And then, in April 1943, the German army found the graves in the Katyn forest. The Germans found the graves in early spring, 1943, during military operations in the Smolensk area that had recently been retaken from Soviet forces. Let us be precise about the motivation here, because precision matters. Germany did not excavate Katyn because it was committed to justice for the Polish people. Germany had its own program of mass murder underway, including the systematic killing of Polish Jews in the extermination camps of the general government. The Nazis were not humanitarians who stumbled upon a Soviet crime and felt moved to report it. They were propagandists who found something politically useful and recognized it immediately. Goebbels understood the political geometry instantly. The Allied coalition Britain, the United States. The Soviet Union was held together by the shared necessity of defeating Germany. It was not held together by ideological compatibility or mutual trust. The British and Americans were deeply suspicious of Stalin. The Soviets were deeply suspicious of their Western allies. The Polish government in exile was suspicious of everyone. With excellent reason, Katyn could blow this coalition apart. If the Polish government demanded an investigation, the Soviets would have to choose between admitting the crime or brazening it out. If they brazened it out, which Goebbels expected, the Poles would be forced to either accept the lie or break with Moscow. If they broke with Moscow, the Soviets would use the break to delegitimize the Polish government in exile and install their own preferred Polish leadership. The Western allies would have to choose sides. This is exactly what happened. The International Forensic Commission's findings were not ambiguous. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to the same timeline. The killings had occurred in the spring of 1940, when the territory was under Soviet control. The most recent dates on the documents in the prisoners' pockets were April 1940. The tree roots growing through the graves indicated approximately 3 years of growth consistent with 1,940, not 1,941. The type of rope, the caliber of bullets, the NKVD pattern bindings, all of it said Soviet Union. Spring 1940. The German announcement on April 13, 1943, presented this evidence. It was as propaganda, extremely effective precisely because it was, as evidence, extremely solid. The Soviet response arrived 48 hours after the German announcement. It was not a denial in the ordinary sense. It was a counter-accusation. The Soviet Information Bureau's communiqué stated that the Polish officers had been in the region west of Smolensk doing construction work in 1941, had fallen into German hands when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and had been murdered by the Germans in the autumn of 1941. The communiqué did not provide evidence for this claim. It asserted it. It stated that the German announcement was a Hitlerite provocation designed to disrupt Allied unity and to cover up German crimes. And then this is the move that reveals the full architectural ambition of the lie. It accused the Polish government in exile of being Nazi collaborators for requesting an international investigation. The Polish government in exile, headed by General Władysław Sikorski, made a decision that was both courageous and strategically catastrophic. It asked the International Red Cross to conduct an independent investigation of Katyn. This was the correct thing to do. It was also exactly what the Soviet Union was waiting for. On April 1923, Pravda published an article titled "The Polish Helpers of Hitler." It described the Polish government in exile as collaborating with Nazi Germany by repeating German propaganda about Katyn. It stated that the Polish government's request for a Red Cross investigation was a vile fascist slander directed against the Soviet Union. 3 days later, on April 25, 1943, Stalin formally broke off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. He had done it. He had used Katyn, the crime he had committed, as the justification for severing ties with the legal government of the country whose officers he had killed. Churchill and Roosevelt were in a position of excruciating diplomatic difficulty. The evidence from Katyn was, to anyone examining it carefully, consistent with Soviet guilt. Churchill received private reports from the British ambassador in Moscow indicating that the physical evidence pointed to Soviet responsibility. Roosevelt received similar assessments from American officials. Both men chose to suppress this information, not because they believed the Soviet denial. The available evidence suggests that neither man was genuinely convinced by it, but because the alternative, publicly acknowledging Soviet guilt for the Katyn massacre in the middle of a war that required Soviet military cooperation, was a diplomatic catastrophe they were not willing to risk. Churchill wrote privately to the Polish Prime Minister urging him to drop the demand for a Red Cross investigation. Roosevelt sent similar pressure through diplomatic channels. The Poles were being told, by their most powerful allies, that the truth about Katyn was less important than Allied unity. This was, strategically, correct. It was also, morally, a betrayal of 22,000 dead people who had been killed by the Soviet Union and were now being told, by the governments that claimed to represent the values of civilization, that asking who killed them was inconvenient. Colonel Van Vliet filed his report. American military intelligence received it. And then American military intelligence, in what the 1952 Madden Committee investigation described as a failure to properly evaluate and act upon clear danger signals, buried it. Van Vliet's report sat in a classified file, unavailable to the public, unavailable to the Poles, unavailable to the world. The truth about Katyn was being suppressed simultaneously by the Soviet Union, which had committed the crime. the Polish Communist government, which had been installed by the Soviet Union, the British government, which needed Soviet military cooperation, the American government, which needed Allied unity. The lie did not survive because it was convincing. It survived because almost every government with access to evidence that could disprove it had reasons to look the other way. When the Soviet army retook the Katyn area in September 1943, the NKVD moved in immediately. They destroyed the cemetery that the Germans had allowed the Polish Red Cross to build over the graves, the physical space that grief had made. They began a witness intimidation campaign. Anyone whose account of events in the Katyn area contradicted the Soviet narrative was warned that they could be charged with collaborating with the Nazis. And they did something more specific. They planted documents on the bodies, fake letters, falsified identification papers, documents with dates in 1941 or later, designed to suggest that the prisoners had still been alive when the German army controlled the area. The planted documents were crude. Most observers who subsequently examined them noted the obvious inconsistencies in paper, ink, and date formatting, but they were enough to give the Soviet version a fig leaf of documentary support. The NKVD's cover-up report, produced in January 1944 by a commission headed by the Soviet neurosurgeon Nikolai Burdenko, and known therefore as the Burdenko Commission, concluded that the Polish officers had been murdered by the Germans in the autumn of 1941. The Burdenko Commission interviewed over 100 witnesses. It examined exhumed bodies. It produced a report with the visual grammar of scientific investigation tables, data, forensic language, official seals. Almost every specific finding in the Burdenko Commission's report was false. The manufactured perpetrator was now official. Germany had killed the Polish officers in 1941. The Soviet Union had the report to prove it, and the post-war world was going to have to decide what to do with two competing versions of a crime, one supported by consistent physical evidence from multiple independent sources, one supported by a Soviet commission whose conclusions matched what the Soviet Union needed them to say. The Soviet Union arrived at Nuremberg with a list of German war crimes it intended to prosecute. On that list, the Katyn massacre, charge number 1, the German defendants had, in September-December 1941, murdered approximately 11,000 Polish prisoners of war in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. This was the Burdenko Commission's finding, incorporated into the formal indictment of the Nuremberg trial. The Soviet prosecutors were attempting something extraordinary. They were trying to have a crime they had committed prosecuted as a crime the Germans had committed. At the same tribunal that was defining the legal standards for crimes against humanity. Moment of quiet contemplation. The German defense team recognized immediately that the Katyn charge was vulnerable. They requested permission to call witnesses. The tribunal agreed with some reluctance to hear 3 defense witnesses and 3 Soviet rebuttal witnesses on the Katyn question. What followed was one of the more extraordinary episodes in the history of international law. The German witnesses included the forensic experts who had participated in the 1943 excavation. They presented the physical evidence, the dated documents, the tree root growth, the bullet types, the binding patterns. Their testimony was methodical, specific, and consistent with the findings of the 12-nation International Commission from 1943. The Soviet rebuttal witnesses presented the Burdenko Commission's findings under cross-examination. Inconsistencies began to appear. The Soviet witnesses were unable to explain how documents dated to 1941 had ended up on bodies that multiple independent forensic examinations had determined were in a state of decomposition consistent with 1940. They were unable to explain why the prisoners' diaries all ended in April 1940. They were unable to explain the specific NKVD pattern rope used to bind the hands. The Nuremberg judges were in an impossible position. They could not acquit Germany of Katyn on the merits of the evidence without formally endorsing the conclusion that the Soviet Union had committed the crime which would destroy the Allied unity the tribunal represented. They could not convict Germany of Katyn against the weight of the evidence without producing a verdict that was manifestly unjust and that would undermine the tribunal's credibility. They chose a third option, the final Nuremberg judgment. Delivered on October 1, simply did not address Katyn. The charge appeared in the indictment. The testimony was heard. And then the judges, in their written judgment, made no finding on the question of Katyn's perpetrators. Germany was not convicted of the Katyn massacre at Nuremberg. Germany was not acquitted either. The judges stepped around the question entirely. This is what international justice looks like when geopolitical necessity collides with evidentiary reality. A blank space where a verdict should be 22,000 people dead in a forest. And the International Tribunal convened specifically to deliver accountability for wartime crimes, declining to say who killed them. The Soviet lie did not win at Nuremberg, but it did not lose. It produced a draw. And in the political context of 1946, a draw was a Soviet victory. Soviet media declared the Nuremberg outcome a vindication. The German defendants had not been convicted of Katyn Soviet propaganda, explained because the evidence was overwhelming, and even the Western powers could not deny it. The acquittal that had not happened was presented as proof that the acquittal had not been necessary. This is the epistemically closed quality of totalitarian propaganda at its most refined, the system in which any outcome confirms the predetermined truth. The arrangement of facts, such that falsification is impossible not because the claims are accurate, but because the interpretive framework converts every input into confirmation. The post-war settlement placed Poland firmly within the Soviet sphere. The Polish People's Republic was established. The government was communist, Soviet-aligned, and entirely dependent on Moscow's political and military support for this government. The Katyn question was not merely a historical matter. It was an existential one. The Soviet Union had killed Poland's officer class in 1940. The Polish communist government owed its existence to the Soviet Union. To acknowledge Soviet guilt for Katyn was to acknowledge the foundational crime of the regime that had installed you. The Polish communist government adopted the Soviet position. Germany had committed the Katyn massacre. This was not optional. This was the price of power in Soviet-era Poland. The word Katyn was, in Soviet Poland, not merely a politically sensitive topic. It was a taboo, akademi, something that could end careers, destroy families, result in arrest. This requires some explanation, because the specific mechanics of how a government suppresses knowledge of its own crime across an entire society for 50 years, across 2 generations, is not simply a matter of censorship. It required the active construction of social consequences for truth-telling that made silence rational. The families of the Katyn victims knew what had happened. Not always in documented detail, the full extent of the NKVD operation would not be confirmed until 1990, but they knew that the person they had lost had last been in Soviet captivity and had stopped communicating in Aprilo 1940. They knew that the Germans had not controlled the Katyn area in April 1940. They knew, and they could not say what they knew. Families that maintained any connection to the Katyn question, that kept photographs of the dead, that observed the date of the disappearance, that mentioned the word in any context that was not the official one, faced specific consequences. Job loss, denial of university places for children, social ostracism, surveillance, in some cases, arrest. Even in Britain, a free country, a country with no obligation to the Soviet line, the Katyn question carried political weight. Plans for a Katyn memorial at Gunnersbury Cemetery in London to be erected by the Polish émigré community were delayed for years by a dispute over the inscription. The Poles wanted to inscribe Caton, 1940. The British government, navigating Cold War, diplomatic sensitivities, found this inscription problematic. The date 1940 made a specific and accurate historical claim about Soviet guilt that the British government was not in the political climate of the 1970s. Eager to make officially, the memorial was eventually erected with the date, but it took years of negotiation to do it. In Poland itself, any memorial with the date 1940 was legally prohibited. Families who put flowers on unofficial Caton memorials were photographed by the secret police. A grave marker with the wrong date was not mourning. It was political subversion. The specific human cost of the Caton lie in Poland was not primarily political. It was emotional and biographical. Tens of thousands of Polish families spent 50 years unable to mourn their dead correctly, unable to say, officially, how they had died, unable to put the date on a grave marker, unable to tell their children the truth about their grandfathers without putting those children in danger. This is what manufactured perpetrators cost. At the level of the individual human life, the corruption of grief, the transformation of mourning into a political act, the situation in which the most private experience a human being has the loss of someone they loved is contaminated by the requirement to lie about how the loss occurred. Grief is supposed to be the one thing that is immune to politics. The Caton lie made grief into espionage. In 1951 and 1952, the United States House of Representatives conducted an extensive investigation of the Caton massacre. The Select Committee, chaired by Representative Ray Madden of Indiana, heard testimony from survivors, witnesses, forensic experts, and intelligence officials across 7 sessions that produced 362 pages of documented evidence. The Madden Committee's conclusion was unanimous. The Soviet NKVD had murdered the Polish officers in the spring of 1940. The committee recommended that the case be referred to the International Court of Justice for prosecution. The recommendation was not acted upon. The State Department, mindful of Cold War diplomacy, did not pursue the Madden Committee's recommendation. The report existed. The conclusion was clear. The finding was unanimous. And the American government, which had gone to some lengths to suppress Van Vliet's report in 1944 and 1945, found it diplomatically inconvenient to formally accuse its geopolitical competitor of a war crime that everyone in the relevant circles already knew it had committed. Across the Soviet bloc, the Burdenko Commission's findings were mandatory official history, not optional, not one interpretation among others. The required version, school textbooks in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the other Warsaw Pact countries all taught the same thing. German forces had murdered Polish officers at Katyn in 1941. This was not presented as a contested historical claim. It was presented as established fact. 2 generations of Eastern European schoolchildren grew up learning this. Some of them believed it. Some of them, particularly Poles, who had access to unofficial knowledge through family networks, knew it was false, but also knew that saying so was dangerous. Some of them existed in the specific cognitive dissonance of knowing the official version was wrong and not knowing how to integrate that knowledge with the fact that the official version was what their grades depended on. This is one of the more specific psychological costs of totalitarian information control. It does not just prevent people from knowing the truth. It puts people in a situation where they must actively perform belief in a version of events they know to be false. Repeatedly. In institutional contexts where their performance of belief is evaluated and has consequences, the corruption is not just of information. It is of the self, the requirement to say what you know not to be true as the price of participation in society. When the Solidarity movement emerged in Poland in 1980, one of its central demands, alongside the right to organize, the right to strike, and the right to political representation, was the demand for honest history. Specifically, the demand for official acknowledgement of Soviet responsibility for Katyn. This was not merely a historical interest. It was a political statement. The claim that Poland's communist government was lying about Katyn was a way of demonstrating that the government was lying about history, about the past, about who was responsible for what. And a government that lies about its most fundamental origin story cannot be trusted about anything. The Solidarity movement was, in part, a movement about who got to determine the truth. Katyn was one of the places where that question was most clearly located. By the early 1980s, the Katyn lie was in what historians of propaganda call a credibility collapse, the condition in which the official version is still required, but no longer believed by any significant portion of the population that knows the subject. The Polish communist government was insisting on German guilt for Katyn, while Solidarity's underground press was publishing the evidence of Soviet guilt. The government knew that a large portion of the population did not believe the official version. The population knew that the government knew. The fiction was being maintained by everyone simultaneously while being believed by no one. This is the terminal condition of a manufactured lie that has been told too long. The moment when the social infrastructure that required its performance collapses faster than the institutional infrastructure that required its assertion. Gorbachev came to power in 1985, facing a system that was, in multiple respects, running out of road. The Katyn question, which had been festering in Polish-Soviet relations for decades, was becoming increasingly difficult to manage as glasnost opened the Soviet public sphere to more honest discussion of the past. Polish historians, newly emboldened by the political changes of 1989 when the communist government fell and was replaced by a Solidarity-led government, were demanding access to Soviet archives. They were not asking politely. They were asking as the representatives of a sovereign state whose relationship with Russia was being rebuilt on new terms. In March 1989, the new Polish government officially shifted the blame for Katyn from Germany to the Soviet NKVD. This was the first official government acknowledgement in any Soviet bloc country that the German guilt narrative was false. It came not from Moscow but from Warsaw, Poland, declaring, 49 years after the fact, the truth about what had happened to its officers. On April 13, 1989, the Soviet Union formally admitted that the NKVD had committed the Katyn massacre. The admission was expressed as profound regret, not an apology, not an acknowledgement of legal responsibility, and not a promise of prosecution of those responsible. All of the actual perpetrators were decades dead. Profound regret. The diplomatic language of an institution, acknowledging something it cannot deny, while minimizing what the acknowledgement requires of it. But it was an admission. After 50 years, after the Burdenko Commission and the Nuremberg filing and the Madden Committee and the Cold War decades and the families who had mourned in whispers and the school children who had been required to write the wrong date in their history, essays, and the underground publishers who had been arrested for printing the truth, the Soviet Union said it. The Katyn massacre was committed by the NKVD in 1940 by Soviet order. In October 1992, Boris Yeltsin transferred to Polish President Lech Wałęsa a set of documents that had been sealed in package number 1, the Soviet state's most classified archive. Among them, the Beria Memorandum of March 5, 1940, Stalin's signature, the Politburo's collective authorization of the massacre of 22,000 Polish prisoners, the smoking gun, 52 years old, released at last. Wałęsa received the documents in Warsaw. He was a man who had spent his career fighting for Polish freedom and Polish truth. He had been imprisoned by the communist government. He had built a movement. He had won an election. And now he was holding, in his hands, the document that proved what Poland had known and been forbidden to say for half a century. The memorial cemetery at Katyn was formally opened in 2000. Over 4,000 graves. Rows of identical crosses. Each cross bearing a name. Each cross bearing a rank. Each cross bearing a date. 1940. The date the Soviet Union had spent 50 years trying to change to 1941. The date that was always true. The date that the forest, with its 3-year-old tree roots and its dated documents and its NKVD pattern bindings, had always been telling anyone willing to look. April 7. 2001. Vladimir Putin and Donald Tusk stood together at the Katyn Memorial. This was not a small thing. It was, in the specific diplomatic vocabulary of Russian-Polish relations, an enormous thing. The Russian Prime Minister, at the site where Soviet forces had killed 22,000 Polish citizens, placing a wreath, acknowledging the crime, participating in a ceremony of remembrance with his Polish counterpart. Andrzej Wajda's film Katyn, a deeply personal work by Poland's greatest filmmaker, whose own father had been killed at Katyn, was broadcast on Russian state television that week. For the first time, a significant Russian audience was watching a Polish film about the massacre, the cover-up, and the families who had mourned in secrecy for decades. It seemed, to observers who had followed the Polish-Russian relationship through the Cold War and into the post-Soviet period, like the beginning of something, not resolution. Resolution was perhaps impossible, but the beginning of genuine acknowledgement. Russia, looking at what the Soviet Union had done and not looking away. 3 days later, the plane went down. The delegation had been flying from Warsaw to attend the official 70-year commemoration of the Katyn massacre. 96 people. The aircraft descended through fog into a forest floor, 8 kilometers from the airport. Everyone aboard died. The reaction in Poland was immediate and overwhelming. Not just grief, though. The grief was genuine and enormous. The decapitation of much of Poland's political and military leadership in a single morning, but a specific emotional resonance. The people traveling to Katyn, to honor the dead of Katyn, had died in Russia on their way to Katyn. Former Polish President Aleksander Kwaśniewski described Katyn as a cursed site. Chairman of the Russian State Duma Konstantin Kosachev said Katyn claimed yet more victims. The immediate Russian response was, in context, notably gracious. President Medvedev declared April 12 a national day of mourning in Russia. Russians laid flowers at Polish embassies. The Kremlin expressed condolences. Russia broadcast Wajda's Katyn film again. On November 26, 2001, the Russian State Duma passed a resolution explicitly admitting that Stalin had personally ordered the Katyn massacre, the first time the Russian government had formally attributed direct personal responsibility to Stalin, going beyond the 1,990 admission of NKVD culpability. Both official investigations concluded that the crash was an accident. The Russian investigation attributed the cause primarily to crew error. The pilots descended in fog below safe minimums, ignored multiple terrain warning alarms, and struck trees short of the runway. The Polish investigation reached broadly similar conclusions about the immediate cause while contributing responsibility to Russian air traffic control's inadequate guidance and the airport's lack of modern instrument landing systems. The investigations disagreed in emphasis and in the assignment of contributory blame, but they agreed on the fundamental nature of the event, an accident, caused primarily by the flight crew's decision to attempt a landing in conditions that exceeded the aircraft's safe operating minimums. What happened next is, in the context of this season's argument about manufactured perpetrators, deeply instructive. and deeply uncomfortable, Jarosław Kaczyński, whose twin brother Lech had died in the crash. They spent the years following the disaster, building a political movement around the claim that the crash was not an accident, that it was a deliberate act, that Russia had killed his brother, that the Polish government that had accepted the accident conclusion led at the time by Donald Tusk was complicit in covering up the truth. The Law and Justice Party, when it came to power in 2015, created an official government commission to re-examine the crash. The commission, chaired by Macierewicz, published reports in 2018 and 2022 claiming that explosive devices had caused the disaster. The commission accused Russia of deliberate sabotage. It accused Tusk of diplomatic treason. International aviation investigators, independent Polish aviation experts, and the available physical evidence did not support these conclusions. The Commission's reports were rejected by the aviation community. The aircraft wreckage retained by Russia, which has consistently declined to return, it could not be independently examined. Russia's retention of the wreckage has itself been cited by conspiracy advocates as evidence of cover-up. That is something worth examining carefully here, not with cruelty toward Jarosław Kaczyński, who lost his twin brother and who carries that grief in ways nobody outside the experience can fully evaluate, but with intellectual honesty about the mechanism. The Katyn massacre was a manufactured perpetrator. The Soviet Union committed the crime and blamed Germany. The lie survived because it was institutionally enforced and geopolitically convenient. The Smolensk conspiracy theory is also a manufactured perpetrator narrative. An accident is reframed as a deliberate crime committed by Russia. It has survived in Polish political culture not because of evidence. The physical and testimonial evidence consistently points to accident, but because the alternative, a meaningless accident, is psychologically unbearable. When the person who died was someone you loved, when the accident occurred in Russia, when Russia had actual historical reasons to have wanted the Polish leadership dead, and when Russia's behavior regarding the wreckage has been opaque and uncooperative. The manufactured perpetrator narrative is particularly compelling when, 1. The actual cause is unbearably arbitrary. An accident in fog is random, meaningless, not anyone's fault in a satisfying way. Assassination as un vilain. It has agency. It makes the death mean something, even if that something is terrible. 2. There is genuine reason to distrust the institution that controls the narrative. Russia has earned Polish distrust through a century of documented lies, of which Katyn is the most prominent. When Russia says this was an accident, Poland has historically good reasons to be skeptical of Russian explanations of events on Russian soil involving Polish deaths. 3. The counter-evidence is physically inaccessible. The wreckage is in Russia. The wreckage has not been returned. It is genuinely impossible to fully verify the accident conclusion through independent physical examination of the aircraft, because the primary evidence is held by the party whose account you are questioning. These conditions created a genuine epistemological problem, a situation in which normal verification procedures cannot be fully applied. And into that problem, the conspiracy narrative expanded. This is not a defense of the conspiracy theory. The evidence that is available, the flight data recorders, the testimony of multiple witnesses, the meteorological records, the independent aviation analysis consistently supports the accident conclusion. There is no credible physical evidence of an explosive device. The commission that claimed otherwise was chaired by a politician who began the investigation convinced of the conclusion he wanted to reach. It is, however, an honest accounting of why manufactured perpetrator narratives are particularly powerful in contexts where real historical betrayal exists. Physical evidence is controlled by the suspected party. The true cause of a terrible event is arbitrary and unsatisfying. This is the mechanism. It is the same mechanism that gave the Soviet lie about Katyn its durability in the West during the Cold War. Not because people believed it, because the truth was inconvenient. The liar was an essential ally, and the alternative, confronting the crime and accepting its implications, was costlier than accepting the lie. The Katyn lie did not die with the Soviet Union. Within Russia, the revisionist position on Katyn, the claim that the massacre was a German crime, or that the Soviet role has been exaggerated, or that the admissions of 1990 and 1992 were made under political pressure and do not represent historical truth, has maintained a presence in nationalist and communist circles that has never fully disappeared. Writer Yuri Mukhin, a Russian nationalist author, has published books arguing that the Germans committed the Katyn massacre. Drawing on a selective reading of the available evidence and dismissing the Russian archival documents as forgeries, his books have found readers. They have not found acceptance in mainstream Russian historical scholarship, but they have demonstrated that the lie has a constituency, a group of people for whom accepting Soviet guilt for Katyn is politically or psychologically unacceptable, and who will find or construct alternative accounts. The Putin government has officially maintained the position that Soviet responsibility for Katyn is acknowledged. Putin attended the April 7, 2010 commemoration. The 2010 State Duma resolution stands. The documents transferred by Yeltsin have not been recalled, but the Putin government has also refused to return the Smolensk wreckage to Poland, declined to classify the Katyn massacre as genocide, rejecting Polish legal efforts to have it formally designated as such, issued rulings through military prosecutors that minimized the legal implications of the massacre, signed off in 2005 on a military prosecutor's ruling that declined to charge anyone because all perpetrators were dead, and rejected the genocide designation on the grounds that the Polish victims were killed for criminal legal motives, rather than for their identity as a demographic group. This is the managed acknowledgement, admitting enough to claim historical reckoning while minimizing legal, financial, and political accountability for what that reckoning implies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine that began in February 2022 placed the Katyn legacy in a new context. The Katyn massacre was, in one of its dimensions, an act of decapitation, the deliberate elimination of Poland's officer class, its professional middle class, its leadership capacity, specifically to reduce Poland's ability to organize national resistance. It was the targeted killing of a nation's institutional capacity. The Russian military operations in Ukraine targeting cultural institutions, educational facilities, civilian infrastructure, and the evacuation centers used by people fleeing Russian advance have prompted Ukrainian officials and international observers to use language cultural erasure, targeting of national identity that echoes the historical analysis of the Katyn operation's strategic logic. This is not to say that the situations are identical. Historical analogies are always imprecise. But the logic of Katyn, kill the people who would organize, lead, resist, is a recognizable strategic concept that the Katyn massacre documented in extreme form, and that has appeared in varying degrees in conflicts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The Katyn lie's afterlife is not merely historical. It is structurally connected to questions about institutional violence, national identity, and the relationship between states and the people they claim to govern, that remain as urgent in 2024 as they were in the Katyn forest in April 1940. We have now traced the Katyn manufactured perpetrator through its full arc. The crime in 1940, in the cover-up beginning in 1943, the lie's institutionalization across the Cold War, and its eventual collapse under the weight of physical evidence that the Earth had kept for 50 years. Let us build the anatomy of the manufactured perpetrator carefully, because it is the mechanism that distinguishes this case from the others in this season. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion manufactured a source, a document that claimed to be evidence of a conspiracy. The stab-in-the-back myth manufactured a defeat, a military victory that had been stolen rather than lost. The lost cause manufactured nobility, a moral elegance that the historical record did not support. The Dreyfus Affair manufactured guilt, a specific individual made to bear responsibility for a crime he did not commit. The Caton Massacre manufactured a perpetrator, a different actor substituted for the actual one, in the account of a crime that genuinely occurred. This is the rarest and most technically demanding form of the big lie, because it requires not merely the suppression of truth but the construction of a complete alternative causal chain. It is not enough to deny the crime. Someone else must be shown to have committed it. And showing someone else to have committed it requires evidence or something that can be passed off as evidence that they are responsible. The manufactured perpetrator has 4 structural requirements. Unlike some of the other big lies in this season, the manufactured perpetrator does not invent a crime. Caton was real. 22,000 people really died. The bodies were really in the forest. The crime's reality is precisely what makes the manufactured perpetrator mechanism necessary. You cannot deny that there is something to explain. This is the mechanism's foundational difference from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which invented a conspiracy that did not exist. The manufactured perpetrator works with a crime that does exist and redirects its causal attribution. This makes it harder to refute, because you cannot argue that the crime did not happen. You can only argue about who did it. The manufactured perpetrator requires that the institution performing the investigation be the same institution that committed the crime. This is obviously a conflict of interest of the most fundamental kind. The Burdenko Commission was a Soviet investigation into a Soviet crime. Its conclusions were predetermined by the identity of the investigating institution. Control of the investigative process allows the manufactured perpetrator to be installed not as a political claim but as a forensic finding, complete with examinations. Witness, testimony, physical evidence, and the visual grammar of scientific procedure. The Burdenko Commission interviewed over 100 witnesses. It examined exhumed bodies. It produced measurements in tables. It looked exactly like a real investigation. The only thing that made it not a real investigation was that it had decided its conclusion before the first witness was called. The manufactured perpetrator cannot survive sustained independent forensic examination of the physical evidence. Every independent examination of the Katyn evidence reached the same conclusion. The killings occurred in 1940, when the Soviets controlled the area. The Soviet lie survived as long as it did, partly because the Soviets controlled the Katyn forest after recapturing it in September 1943, and could limit access to the physical evidence, the planted documents, the destroyed cemetery, the intimidated witnesses. All of these were possible because the Soviet Union controlled the site. When Yeltsin transferred the archival documents to Poland in 1992, he was releasing evidence that the Soviet Union had controlled for 52 years. The manufactured perpetrator collapsed completely the moment the actual documentary record Beria's memorandum. Stalin's signature became independently accessible. The contemporary version of this dynamic Russia's retention of the Smolensk wreckage illustrates why control of physical evidence remains central to the manufactured perpetrator's survival. The Smolensk conspiracy theories have been unable to find purchase in the official investigations, partly because the flight recorder data and the testimony of multiple independent witnesses are available. They have been sustained partly by the unavailability of the aircraft itself. The manufactured perpetrator's most remarkable survival mechanism is not its internal logic but its external utility to people who know it is false. The Katyn lie survived in Western official discourse, not because Western governments believed it, but because they found it diplomatically convenient to avoid directly contradicting it. Churchill knew. Roosevelt received assessments pointing to Soviet guilt. Van Vliet's report was suppressed. The Madden Committee's recommendations were not pursued, not because the Americans and British believed the Soviet account, but because they calculated that the diplomatic cost of directly accusing the Soviet Union of the Katyn massacre exceeded the moral cost of maintaining a studied ambiguity about its perpetrators. This is the external utility of the manufactured perpetrator. It gives third parties, people who did not commit the crime and did not commission the cover-up, a convenient version of events that they can accept without formally endorsing. Because accepting it costs them less than confronting it. Every manufactured perpetrator in history has survived partly through this mechanism. The people who know the truth and choose not to say it, because saying it costs them something they would rather not pay. The Katyn forest remembered what the Soviet Union tried to make it forget, not through any mystical property of the land itself, but because physical evidence has a durability that institutional narratives do not. The tree roots grew at the rate that tree roots grow. The documents in the prisoners' pockets retained their dates. The caliber of the bullets was 7. The pattern of the bindings was NKVD standard. None of these things could be instructed to change their testimony to match what the Burdenko Commission needed them to say. This is the ultimate limit of the manufactured perpetrator. The physical world does not comply with institutional requirements. It preserves what it preserves, without regard for what that preservation will eventually demonstrate. And when the people controlling access to the physical evidence eventually lose control through political change, through archival release, through the collapse of the system that has been maintaining the lie, the evidence says what it has always said. The truth does not emerge from the forest. It was always there. It just required the right conditions for anyone to be allowed to look. Let us begin the closing argument with a question that the Katyn case poses more sharply than any of the other episodes in this season. What makes a lie last 50 years? Not the quality of the lie. The Burdenko Commission's findings were not convincing to most independent observers, even at the time. The Nuremberg judges decided not to rule on Katyn, rather than accept the Soviet account. The Madden Committee concluded unanimously in 1952 that the Soviets were responsible. British intelligence knew. American intelligence knew. The physical evidence had always pointed in the same direction. The lie was not convincing. It lasted 50 years anyway. Why? The answer is not because people believed it. The answer is because the people who needed to challenge it calculated that the cost of challenging it exceeded the benefit. This is the manufactured perpetrator's primary survival mechanism, and it is different from the survival mechanism of the other big lies in this season in an important way. The protocols of the Elders of Zion survived because people believed it, or at least because enough people needed it to be true that they refused to engage with the evidence against it. The stab-in-the-back myth survived because it offered psychological comfort to a population that could not process its defeat. The lost cause survived because it was built into identity across generations. The Dreyfus affair survived, as long as it did because an institution committed to its own verdict. The Katyn lie survived differently. It survived in the West not through belief but through the deliberate decision not to engage with the evidence, through the conscious calculation of governments that knew the truth and decided their interests were better served by ambiguity than by clarity. This is the most institutionally sophisticated form of the big lie's survival, not propaganda that has deceived its audience, but a lie that its audience knows to be a lie and chooses not to challenge. Churchill's private correspondence from 1943 reveals a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He was not deceived by the Soviet account of Katyn. He was suppressing his disbelief for strategic reasons, and he was asking the Polish government to suppress its grief and its demand for truth for the same reasons. The moral weight of this should not be minimized. Churchill was, in this instance, asking bereaved families, the wives and children and parents of 22,000 murdered men, to accept a lie about how their loved ones died because the geopolitical moment required it. He was not wrong about the geopolitical calculation. The Soviet alliance was essential to defeating Germany. The Soviet alliance was worth enormous costs. He may have been right that the Katyn confrontation would not have changed the outcome in Poland's favor. Stalin was going to install a Soviet-friendly government in Warsaw, regardless of whether the Katyn question was officially resolved. But being right about the strategic calculation did not make the ask any less brutal. It did not make the lie any less of a lie. And it did not prevent the 50 years of silence that followed. The outermost circles of the concentric pattern of acquiescence, the Western governments making diplomatic calculations, are easy to analyze and relatively easy to evaluate morally. They made choices between competing goods, got the strategic calculation roughly right, and paid a moral cost that historians can document. The innermost circles are harder. The Polish families who were required not merely to accept the lie but to live inside it, to perform it in the school essays their children wrote, and the official documents they filed when trying to register the deaths of their loved ones. These people were not making strategic calculations. They were surviving. They were choosing to not be arrested, not to lose their jobs, not to put their children at risk. The survival calculation in a totalitarian system is not between truth and comfortable acquiescence. It is between truth and imprisonment, between truth and your children's futures. The Katyn lie extracted its most intimate cost not from the governments that acquiesced to it, but from the people who were required to live inside it. 22,000 people. They were not symbols. They were not the collective representation of Polish national identity. They were individuals. The physician who had practiced medicine in Lwów, the lawyer who had argued cases in Warsaw, the teacher who had taught mathematics in Krakow, the reserve officer who had been a civil engineer in peacetime and who had been called up when the war began, the policeman from a small town in eastern Poland, the young lieutenant fresh from the military academy. Each of them walked into a Russian forest in April 1940 and did not walk out. Each of them had a family who, for 50 years, it was not permitted to say correctly how they had died. The manufactured perpetrator does not pay its costs to governments and alliances. Those costs are real, but they are abstract diplomatic relations, geopolitical calculations, historical reputations. The manufactured perpetrator pays its most intimate costs to the families who are left to mourn without being allowed to name what they are mourning. This is what the Katyn lie cost. Not in the aggregate of geopolitics. In the specific. The daughter who could not put her father's death date on a grave marker. The son who could not write in his school essay what he knew to be true. The widow who kept a photograph hidden because the photograph was of a man in the uniform of an army that the official version said had not been killed by the people who had actually killed him. These are the costs that the geopolitical calculations do not capture, that the historical analyses of wartime diplomacy do not fully represent, that the narrative of the lie's eventual exposure and the reconciliation ceremonies of 2010 cannot erase, because you cannot restore 50 years of corrupted grief to the people who lived through it. The Katyn mechanism, the manufactured perpetrator in its full form, has been reproduced in multiple contexts since 1940. Not always with the same scale, not always with the same duration, not always with the same eventual outcome, but with the same structural logic. A state commits a crime, undistributes it to a different actor, and controls the investigative process and the physical evidence long enough to prevent the attribution from being definitively challenged. Several patterns emerge from examining these cases alongside Katyn. In every major manufactured perpetrator case since Katyn, the responsible party has established an official investigation commission whose mandate, composition, and terms of reference were designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. The commissions differ in their sophistication. Some are more carefully constructed than others, but they share the defining characteristic of the Burdenko Commission. They are instruments of conclusion, production, rather than truth discovery. The contemporary analog is the official investigation conducted by the responsible state, whose findings consistently exonerate the state. The pattern is so consistent across cases that the announcement of an official investigation by the suspected party without independent international oversight has become a reliable indicator that the findings will not be credible. Katyn was eventually exposed, primarily through archival evidence, the Beria Memorandum. The NKVD execution orders released when the political system that had been protecting them collapsed. The physical evidence in the forest had always pointed in the right direction. What changed was the political willingness to allow its implications to be acted upon. In contemporary manufactured perpetrator cases, the physical evidence problem takes a specific form. The responsible party controls access to the site, to the wreckage, to the bodies, to the forensic evidence. International investigators are denied access, or given limited access under conditions that the controlling party manages, or given access after the site has been altered. The physical evidence problem is not always resolvable through satellite imagery and open-source intelligence, though these tools have significantly reduced the controlling party's ability to fully manage a crime scene in the way the NKVD managed the Katyn forest. In Katyn, the Western democracy's incentive was wartime alliance. They needed the Soviet Union. They chose ambiguity. In contemporary cases, the incentives vary, but the mechanism is consistent. A state or alliance of states has economic, military, or diplomatic reasons to avoid directly confronting another state over a specific atrocity, and the manufactured perpetrator provides a convenient ambiguity to inhabit. This is not always cynical. Sometimes the incentives are genuinely in tension. The cost of confrontation may include outcomes worse than the original crime. Sometimes the responsible state is also an essential partner in addressing other threats. The strategic calculation that Churchill made in 1943 has contemporary analogs that are equally painful and equally morally costly, but the pattern is recognizable. And the cost paid not by the governments making the calculation but by the families of the dead who cannot get accountability is recognizable too. The Katyn lie lasted 50 years and then collapsed. The specific cause of collapse was political. The Soviet system that had been maintaining the lie ended, and the successor system had incentives to release the evidence that the previous system had been protecting. The same pattern appears in other manufactured perpetrator cases. The lie eventually fails. Not because the physical evidence suddenly becomes available, it was always there, but because the political system protecting access to that evidence changes. Political change creates the conditions for historical truth. Historical truth does not, on its own, overcome political systems that are actively protecting manufactured accounts. This is the sobering lesson in the Katyn case. And the truth emerged not through the heroic persistence of investigators or the eventual persuasiveness of the evidence, but through the collapse of the empire that had been maintaining the lie. The families of the Katyn victims did not win a moral argument about what had happened. They outlasted a political system. Outlasting is a form of victory. It is an expensive, exhausting, decades-consuming form of victory. It extracts costs that cannot be reclaimed, but it is, historically, the mechanism by which manufactured perpetrator lies most commonly fail, not through being disproved but through being outlasted. The digital information environment has changed the physics of the manufactured perpetrator in one significant and specific way. The controlling party's ability to manage physical access to a crime scene no longer provides the same information control it provided in 1943. Open source intelligence, satellite imagery, flight tracking, social media, geolocation, intercept analysis has created multiple independent records of events that cannot be destroyed or controlled by the party that controls the physical site. The NKVD could destroy the cemetery, plant documents, intimidate witnesses, and manage the physical evidence at Katyn, because there was no parallel digital record. The crime was documented only in the physical space they controlled and in the archives they sealed. Contemporary atrocities occur in an environment where satellite imagery captures the before and after of sites, where flight tracking records the movements of aircraft, where communications metadata records the presence of specific military units in specific locations. and where social media posts by participants can be geolocated and timestamped by researchers sitting at computers thousands of miles from the event. This does not make manufactured perpetrators impossible. It makes them harder to sustain indefinitely and considerably more expensive to maintain. The physical evidence problem, which the Soviet Union solved through direct control, cannot be fully solved in an environment where evidence exists in distributed digital form beyond the responsible party's reach. The Budenko Commission could not have produced its 1944 report in an era of Bellingcat and Maxar satellite imagery. The technology does not guarantee truth. It can be misused, misread, and manipulated, like any other evidence, but it changes the information landscape in ways that make the Katyn mechanism significantly harder to execute. Andrzej Wajda made Katyn in 2007. His father had been killed at Katyn in 1940. He had been making the film, in different ways, his entire career. The formal version was released when he was 80 years old. In the film's final sequence, a Polish woman fights to have her brother's tombstone inscribed with the date 1940, the true date, rather than the state-mandated false date. She is refused. She keeps fighting. The film ends without resolution, with the correct date still being struggled for. When the film was released in 2007, that struggle was officially over. The correct date was on the memorial crosses. The Soviet admission had been made. The Beria Memorandum had been released. Stalin's signature was part of the historical record. Wajda was not making a film about an unresolved question. He was making a film about the cost of the years before the resolution, the decades when the answer was known and could not be said. The film screened in Russia on state television twice in April 2010, once before the commemoration ceremony, once after the crash. Wajda did in 2016. He never saw his film broadcast commercially in Russia. It was shown on state television but not given wide commercial release. The forest is properly marked. The archives are available. The date is correct. The cost of getting there, 50 years of corrupted grief, of whispered conversations, of hidden photographs, of school essays written in the wrong year, of families that could not correctly name what had happened to them remains. The manufactured perpetrator does not merely falsify history. It puts the people who know the true history in the position of choosing between truth and survival. For as long as the system that requires the lie is powerful enough to make that choice consequential. In Katyn's case, that was 50 years. The people who paid that cost are mostly gone now. Their children are elderly. The grandchildren are the ones visiting the memorial, reading the names, looking at the date 1940, understanding what the date means. They know what the lie cost. The question this season keeps asking is whether knowing what a lie cost is sufficient to prevent the next one. The honest answer, as we have now established across 5 episodes, is not automatically, not reliably, not without sustained institutional effort to build the accountability mechanisms, the independent investigations, the free press, the adversarial legal systems, the archival transparency that give truth something better than outlasting the systems that protect falsehood. The forest remembered. The mechanism that made the forgetting possible is still available.